Perceptive Power, Chapter 8, The Power of Attention. We wish now to direct your attention to that wonderful power of the mind which is known as attention, and to indicate to you certain fundamental laws of its activity. Attention is defined as the mental act, process, or faculty of application to any object of sense, representation, or thought, or the act of concentrating the mind on any object of sense, or on any mental conception. A more technical definition is consciousness concentrated in order intellectually to conquer a particular object or subject. The scientific conception of attention is well illustrated by the following celebrated statement of Sir William Hamilton. Attention is consciousness and something more. It is consciousness voluntarily applied, under its law of limitations, to some determinate object. It is consciousness concentrated. Attention is consciousness applied by an act of will or desire under a particular law. This law, which we call the law of limitation, is that the intention of our knowledge is in the inverse ratio of its extension. In other words, that the fewer the objects we consider at once, the clearer and more distinct will be our knowledge of them. An act of attention, that is, an act of concentration, seems as necessary to every exertion of consciousness as a certain contraction of the pupil is requisite to every execution of vision. Attention is to consciousness what the concentration of the pupil is to sight, or to the eye of the mind what the microscope or telescope is to the bodily eye. The faculty of attention is not, therefore, a special faculty, but is merely consciousness acting under the law of limitation to which it is subjected. But whatever be its relation to the special faculties, attention doubles all their efficiency and affords them a power of which they would otherwise be destitute. It is, in fact, as we are at present constituted, the primary condition of their activity. Attention, then, is this action of the mind whereby it brings into consciousness any subject or object to which that action is directed. It is the focusing of consciousness, or some prefer to say it is a detention in consciousness. The sun's rays may be scattered over a large surface and its heat scarcely be perceptible. Or on the other hand, they may be focused through a sunglass to such an extent that they burn a hole in a piece of hardwood. In the same way, you may spread your consciousness over a number of objects and thus become but dimly aware of any of them. And on the other hand, you may concentrate and focus your consciousness by an act of attention so as to become most intensely and most vividly aware of the facts concerning that object. As Hamilton has said in the above quoted statement, the fewer objects we consider at once, the clearer and more distinct will be our knowledge of them. Psychologists usually divide the activities of attention into two great classes. One, involuntary attention, and two, voluntary attention. Involuntary attention is that form of attention which you give to the passing objects which arouse your interest or curiosity, or even by your passing notice. Your attention is attracted easily to such objects or events without any effort on your part. This form of attention is an almost automatic, instinctive, or purely reflex action arising from the stimulation of the senses or appeal to the feelings. No effort of the will is required in such cases. In fact, it often requires a distinct effort of the will to direct the attention away from such distracting sensations or feelings. Young children, even infants, and the lower animals manifest involuntary attention to a marked degree. In fact, it is held that very young children are incapable of any other form of attention. Uncultured persons manifest but very little attention other than this. Many persons who have failed to cultivate voluntary attention properly get but slightly beyond the stage of involuntary attention at any time. They may habitually manifest such reflex conscious action. Almost any passing stimulus will take their attention away from their work or tasks. Involuntary attention is awakened chiefly by one or more of the following general causes. One, present enjoyment or pleasurable sensation, the attentive process continuing merely so long as the sensation affords pleasure. The same rule applies to pain and painful sensations. 2. Curiosity or curious interest, the attentive process continuing merely so long as the curiosity remains unsatisfied. 3. Novelty or unexplained objects or events, the attentive process continuing merely so long as the explanation is lacking or until the novelty passes away. 4. Sudden impressions upon the senses, such as sudden and startling movements, sights, or sounds, the attentive process continuing merely so long as the sudden and startling quality of the sensation persists. 5. Intensity of sensation, such as that arising from a flash of lightning, an explosion, loud speaking, or cries, or any similar intensely exciting object or event reported by sensation. The distinguishing characteristic of involuntary attention of any and all forms is this: it is called forth by the influence on the mind directly exerted by an external object or event itself. It is not directed by conscious will. Its activity is practically automatic, instinctive, or reflex, and not voluntary or deliberate. Voluntary attention is that form of attention which you give to objects or subjects selected or determined by your reason, and which is directed by an act of your will accompanied by more or less sense of mental effort. It is always consciously directed to some object or subject of your own selection, and is always manifested with at least a slight degree of the peculiar sense of conscious effort which distinguishes all will activities. This characteristic sense of conscious voluntary direction and effort is the test between the activities of voluntary attention and involuntary attention. It is always present in the former and always lacking in the latter. By many of the best psychologists, voluntary attention is regarded as one of the most important and one of the most characteristic activities of the will. Voluntary attention is one of the leading characteristics of individuals manifesting marked willpower, men of culture and practical mental development, students who succeed, successful men of affairs, inventors, discoverers, in short, of men and women who are mental masters instead of mental slaves. It is a mark of experience, reasoning power, and willpower. It distinguishes the individuals of deliberation, of determination, of purposive resolution. To develop it in children is one of the first and often the most difficult of the tasks of the teacher. It may be stated as a general principle or rule that every individual who has accomplished anything worthwhile in any field of voluntary endeavor has done so largely by his or her developed and trained powers of voluntary attention. It may be stated with equal certainty that no individual lacking in development of the power of voluntary attention ever has accomplished anything worthwhile in the field of voluntary endeavor, so long as such lack persists. The distinguishing characteristic of voluntary attention of any and all forms is this: it is called forth not by the direct influence upon the mind exerted by an external object or event itself, but instead by the influence exerted upon the mind by reason of the perceived relation existing between the observed subject, object, or event, and something else which in and of itself attracts the thought, feeling, and will by reason of its own qualities. There must always be an attraction calling forth attention, it is true, but in involuntary attention, the attraction is direct, while in voluntary attention, it is indirect. Involuntary attention acts in direct response to a simple feeling, while voluntary attention acts because of a purpose and determination to do, to know, or to attain something. Involuntary attention is elementary and instinctive. Voluntary attention is derivative and complex and is an acquired faculty. The former moves to satisfy a simple feeling. The latter moves to accomplish a purpose based upon the satisfaction of a higher, deeper, and more complex feeling. The former is superficial and transient. The latter is more fundamental and stable. From this point, our consideration of attention shall be confined to voluntary attention, for that is the phase and form of attention which you must develop, cultivate, and train in order to attain to that phase of personal power, which is the subject matter of this book, i.e., perceptive power. Voluntary attention and sensation. In our previous consideration of the subject of sensation, we have called your attention to the fact that you are conscious merely of a very few of the many reports of sensation which reach you over the channels of your senses, and that such reports fail to reach the plane of your conscious recognition. As all of these reports are more or less calculated to arouse your involuntary attention, why is it that some of them succeed while others fail? The answer to the last question is that in many cases, the more familiar sensations fail to register because of their lack of novelty, their lack of appeal to curiosity, or from similar failure to satisfy the demands of your involuntary attention, which we have previously classified. But there is another reason, namely that your voluntary attention tends to shut out and inhibit, to a great extent, those sensations which are not in harmony and agreement with certain thoughts, feelings, or purposes which your mind is set upon, and tends to give welcome admission to those which possess the requisite quality of harmony and agreement. You may not be fully conscious of this work of selection, but your voluntary attention is aware of it and is performing it all the time. There is a constant struggle for existence in your consciousness manifested by the sensations flowing in through the various channels of the senses. The law of the survival of the fittest decides the struggle, but the fittest are always those to which the greatest degree of voluntary attention is given by you. If your power of voluntary attention is developed and trained by practice and habit, it will shut out from consciousness those inflowing sensations which are not in accord with that what is on your mind, while admitting and welcoming those which are in accord with it. It is an axiom of psychology that if attention is centered upon one of the several classes of sensations, that selected class will at once assume greatly increased strength and intensity, while those opposed to it will lose power and intensity. This is particularly true when the attention happens to be voluntary attention. The moral is obvious. It has well been said that persons of weak powers of voluntary attention are practically at the mercy of their sensations, that they belong less to themselves than to the subject or object which happens to attract their involuntary attention. It being remembered that the intensity of sensation depends largely upon the degree of attention bestowed upon it, you should choose well the many candidates for attention which throng the corridors of sensation, seeking admission through your door of perception. You doubtless have had many personal experiences in which your attention was so strongly attracted and held by certain objects or ideas that you became almost totally oblivious to all else that was going on around you. One in a brown study or indulging in a daydream often has this experience. An ardent lover frequently becomes oblivious of everything else and everybody else in the world except oneself and the loved ones. You remember the old line about only one world and only two persons in it, etc. Do you not? Science ignores the indwelling romance and sees in this phenomenon merely another case of concentrated attention and inhibition of subordinate sensations. How often have you been so engrossed in your newspaper or in your thoughts that you have been carried past your railroad station or other destination? The same explanation applies to such cases. A celebrated French writer, intensely occupied with his work, was totally oblivious of the terrible happenings of the massacre of St. Bartholomew, although the center of the carnage was directly beneath his windows. A noted German philosopher was so deeply buried in his studies that he did not hear the great guns of the bombardment of his college town, and after the surrender of the town, he was surprised when the soldiers of Napoleon broke into his room searching for escaped prisoners. Socrates once became so thoroughly engrossed in philosophical thought when he was in the army that he stood stock still and allowed the entire army to pass on without being aware of anything unusual. It was only when hours later he solved the perplexing problem that he discovered that the army was many miles away from where he had been standing, he was forced to march half the night to overtake his company. Many instances are recorded in which persons have been severely wounded, but who, by reason of their intense mental concentration upon something else, have not perceived their pain for some time afterward. Public speakers suffering great physical pain have temporarily inhibited the perception of it by concentrating their attention upon their addresses. Noted writers suffering from excruciating neuralgia have been known to inhibit continuance of the pain by concentrating upon their work. Many persons have inhibited the pain of minor surgical operations or of wounds by intently thinking about something else. There is every difference between the painful sensation upon which the mind is kept and a similar one where the mind is kept off of it, as all physicians know. It is related of Henry Clay that he once became so intensely engrossed in the delivery of one of his great speeches in Congress that he failed to perceive the repeated prickings of a large pin vigorously applied by a fellow congressman. This latter performance resulting from a previous request from Clay that he be halted in his speech after a certain time had elapsed. The pin wounds repeatedly drew blood from his leg, but Clay never felt the sensation. Some have held that the stoical endurance of the American Indian and the spiritual endurance of the martyrs arose from the same general cause. In the one case, the dominant idea of traditional courage and endurance occupied the attention. In the other case, the exaltation of faith was the inhibiting factor. The same psychological principle was involved in each case. Voluntary attention and observation, thought, and memory. Voluntary attention is an indispensable factor of intelligent observation and thought. What we actually perceive and observe concerning any subject or object depends almost entirely upon the degree of voluntary attention that we bestow upon it. The great difference between the man of great powers of observation and reflection and the ordinary man is that the former attentively observes the facts concerning matters which he is investigating and perceives resemblances and differences between them, which later form the basis of his reasoning on the subject. Some have asserted that the principal difference between the efficient man and the inefficient one lies in the greater capacity of the former for close, continuous, concentrated voluntary attention. Some indeed have asserted that in the capacity for concentrated voluntary attention is to be found the secret of genius. Newton was fond of asserting that the sole difference between himself and ordinary men consisted of his greater power of concentrated voluntary attention. It is an axiom of memory culture that memory depends primarily upon the degree of attention given to the original impression and to its repetitions in the process of its recollection. As might be expected from the foregoing, it has been found that one of the most marked characteristics of a weak mind is that of a lack of ability to concentrate the voluntary attention upon a subject or object for any marked length of time or with any marked degree of intensity. Medical science informs us that imbeciles and idiots are practically destitute of the power of concentrated voluntary attention, and that in certain forms of mental disorders, one of the most characteristic symptoms is that of steadily weakening voluntary attention. In old age, when the mind begins to weaken and fail, it will be noticed that the aged person is able to remember quite well the events of his early years, but that he is unable to concentrate sufficient attention upon present happenings to fix them in his memory. In illness, the power of voluntary attention often is temporarily weakened. The following several quotations from eminent psychologists may prove of interest in this connection. Hamilton says, "Attention constitutes the better half of all intellectual power." Brodie says, "It is attention more than any difference in the abstract power of reasoning, which constitutes the vast difference which exists between minds of different individuals." Butler says, "The most important intellectual habit that I know of is the habit of attending exclusively to the matter at hand." It is commonly said that genius cannot be infused by education, yet this power of concentrated attention, which belongs as a part of his gift to every great discoverer, is unquestionably capable of almost indefinite augmentation by resolute practice. The laws of voluntary attention. The following are the most general and important laws of voluntary attention. 1. The value of interest. Attention attaches itself more easily to interesting subjects or objects. It rebels against attachment to uninteresting subjects or objects. The greater the degree of interest that exists or can be created in a subject or object to which it is desired that attention shall attach itself, the greater the ease with which attention is directed towards such, and the greater the ease in holding it there. But where interest is originally lacking in the subject or object of attention, it may be created by associating these with other subjects or objects in which interest abides, or else by examining the original subject or object for possible points of interest, the latter usually being discovered in the course of the examination or else being awakened by the latter. 2. Variety of stimulus. Attention tends to decline and weaken if the original stimulus remains unvaried and becomes monotonous. Novelty in an object or subject tends to awaken interest and thus to give intensity to attention. When the novelty vanishes, interest wanes and attention loses its stimulus. The remedy is found in so conducting the observation as gradually to unfold new attributes in the subject or object, or else by changing the viewpoint so as to present the subject or object from a new angle of interest. The discovery of new attributes, properties, qualities, or associations in objects or subjects under consideration will usually awaken new interest, and as a consequence, renewed attention. Such process of awakening new interest at the same time tends to vary the stimulus and to add variety to the mental task. 3. Physical strain. When attention is directed constantly toward a certain object or subject for too long a period of time, the nervous system, including the brain cells, become wearied and their efficiency becomes temporarily impaired. The remedy for this is found in the method of dividing the subject or object into mental sections or classes, each class or section being observed, examined, or considered separately. The attention then being directed to the next section or class when signs of weariness manifest themselves. By breaking up the process in this way, you obtain not only the relief from the physical strain, but also add new interest, varying stimulus, and a better impression upon the memory. 4. Resting attention. When voluntary attention becomes wearied from too constant application to a certain task, it should be rested, but it is not necessary to give it the rest of an entire absence of attention to any object or subject, as in sleep, drowsiness, or similar states. Though, of course, a normal amount of sleep is necessary for health and efficiency. The voluntary attention, or rather your power of voluntary attention, may be effectively rested by several methods. The two most important are the following. 1. By directing the voluntary attention into entirely different channels, or 2, by withdrawing the voluntary effort and allowing involuntary attention to occupy the field for a time. The reason for each of these methods is given in the following paragraphs. A. By directing the voluntary attention into different channels, you bring variety, new interest, and a new stimulus into play. The mental spirit of attention is invigorated and re-energized, and your physical nervous system and brain cells are rested by reason of the change of the direction of the attention. Many busy men rest themselves by changing their mental tasks from time to time under this method by thinking of something else. B. By allowing involuntary attention to exert itself for the time, such as looking out of the window, light reading, taking a walk, playing an out-of-the-door game, attending a play or movie picture, you obtain rest under this second method. This also being true if you indulge in a reverie or daydream, allowing imagination full sway for the time being. Some of the brightest thinkers have rested themselves after periods of intense application of voluntary attention, by reading light stories or detective tales, by playing simple games or romping with the children, or by similar forms of diversion.